Last Sunday, when we held a question box sermon, there were a few themes that emerged, clusters of questions that sounded similar to each other. You can hear one in these questions. I have a question about our first principle. I struggle to accept the inherent worth and dignity of people who commit great evil. How can I reconcile this tension? Or this one, how to internally believe in the inherent worth and dignity of all people, i.e. President Trump, they wrote. I'm reading it verbatim. Regardless of his disregard, disrespect, and dishonesty for all that he disagrees with and fears. The ongoing struggle to truly embrace our first principle. How do you balance outrage and love? You can hear a similar theme in this cluster. How do I handle the anger? Is it okay to be intolerant of hatred? Yes. How can we find the courage to approach those who don't agree with us to listen and understand? All of these questions are related to the topic of peace. And today I'm going to address the idea of peace broadly, and then on Sunday, December 16th, we'll talk more about practicing peace as we're stepping up to disagreement, disruption, and protest, and what difference our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, makes in our approach. A few minutes ago, we greeted one another. Most Sundays, we call that greeting each other with the peace of the morning. And we end our meditation and prayer by saying, peace be with you. What do we mean by that? We hope you don't find yourself in an active combat zone today. Yep, sure, yeah, okay. Of course, we hope that. But of course, the word peace has to do with more than the absence of war or fighting. It's also a state of well-being, as when we talk about inner peace. It's freedom from torment, scarcity, or suffering. It's a state of being unafraid for one's spiritual or physical well-being, a state without external or internal strife, a state without threat. It's a state of abundance and safety. So we say, peace be with you. The word for peace used throughout most of the Bible is the Hebrew word shalom, and shalom means peace, wholeness, and completeness. It's personal, and it's local, as in among the community, and it's global. Shalom exists when everyone lives in a state of well-being and none are oppressed by others. When we think of peace as only the absence of war, that's not true peace. We can see from the history of the world that the absence of war is shaky and temporary. As we can see, true peace has as much to do with people's hearts and their minds. It has as much to do with their hearts and their minds and the resulting social structures that are created as it does to do with physical violence. The Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh also speaks of the connection between personal and global peace. He writes, "We often think of peace as the absence of war, that if the powerful countries would reduce their weapons arsenals, we could have peace. But if we look deeply into the weapons, we see our own minds, our prejudices, fears, and ignorance. Even if we transport all the bombs to the moon, the roots of war and the roots of the bombs are still here in our hearts and minds, and sooner or later we will make new bombs. To work for peace is to uproot war from ourselves and from the hearts of men and women." And then he says, "Looking deeply together is the main task of a religious community." So we're right on target with your questions last week. To work for peace is to uproot war from ourselves and from our hearts. It is to uproot within ourselves the idea of an enemy and the desire for revenge or destruction. The heart of peace is compassion for yourself and for others. And yes, that includes everyone. The thing about dehumanizing or having a lack of compassion is that it is self-replicating. The minute we begin making exceptions, the minute we treat some people as though they don't have inherent worth and dignity, and we wish them suffering, or we inflict it upon them, or we treat them as objects or garbage to be thrown away, the minute we do those things, we set off rippling effects. Jarvis Masters is a prisoner on death row at San Quentin. He's been at San Quentin since he was 19 years old. He's in his 50s now. When he was in his 20s, Masters became a Buddhist, and with the help of a Tibetan teacher who came to the prison, he took a vow to never cause harm and, to the best of his ability, to try to help. A tall order in a place like San Quentin. He wrote a book about it called Finding Freedom. In the book, he shares stories about the lengths he sometimes has to go to in order to promote peace inside the prison. For example, one time, tensions were very high between the prison guards and the prisoners, and you could tell something was about to happen. There was going to be some violence. Masters could tell that some kind of an outlet was needed ASAP. So he convinced the prisoners to take a different action. He convinced them to flood an entire level of the prison. He said, instead of killing the guards, let's make them stay late. It's not usually what we think of as peace, right? Flooding a prison level, but it does not debase or destroy the guards' lives to do so. Many of the guards are reasonable people, but some are not, and when they get into a bad mood, they take it out on the prisoners. One day when there was a lot of this kind of thing happening, a fellow inmate asked Jarvis Masters how he could stay so calm. Was it his Buddhism? And Masters replied, "It has nothing to do with Buddhism. I just think that if I retaliate, they'll go home and beat their kids. I don't want that to happen to any of those little kids." Jarvis himself grew up in abusive homes. The minute we treat some people as though they do not have inherent worth and dignity, and we wish them suffering or we inflict it upon them, we set off rippling effects. In the Christian scriptures, Jesus urges people to commit radically to peace. In Luke 6:27, he says, "Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you." It's easy to love those who love you, he goes on to say. It's easy to do good to those who do good to you, but what does that prove? Commit to peace, be merciful, do not judge, do not condemn, forgive, give. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. I can feel it flying through the air like a bunch of tomatoes, right? Some of you are thinking, what about standing up for what's right? What about human rights? What about my right to exist? If my foes take away my right to be married, should I give them the rest of my rights too? If they take the life of my loved one, am I to send them another relative? Let me tell you something. I have two mantras in my journal. One is, I am love. The other is, I don't take any BS. It's a little bit crudely worded. It's my journal, okay? But what it's about is the intersection of love and justice. At the intersection of love and justice, that is where peacemaking lives. Sherry Maples was a police officer who studied Buddhism under Thich Nhat Hanh, and she also wondered how standing up, defending, and enforcing could square with teachings of compassion. What do I do when someone's beating another person? Am I supposed to stand there and watch them? Maples asked. At first, she did not think she could be both a cop and be peace, as Thich Nhat Hanh teaches. But she discovered that she could. She tells the story of responding to a police call when an angry man was basically holding his young daughter hostage. There hadn't been any violence yet, but the little girl and the mother were both very scared, very intimidated by what the man was doing. Maples arrived, and she got the daughter away from the man. She took care of her. and she tended to the mother, and she sent them to a safe place. Maples says she's about 5'3", and she had her gun belt on, and this guy was like 6'6". She says at that point, she usually would have slapped the handcuffs on the guy and hauled him off to jail. But this time, she decided to just try something else. She had just returned from a Buddhist retreat. So she went back to the man, and in her words, she just spoke to him from her heart. Within 5 minutes, he was bawling, and she was holding him, gun belt still on, right? A few days later, she ran into him when she was off duty, and he gave her a huge bear hug and told her that she had saved his life that night. Maples speaks of the fierce bodhisattva. A bodhisattva is somebody who takes up the path of the Buddha in their lives, practicing mindfulness and compassion. Images of fierce bodhisattvas are common at Buddhist temples. Maples writes, "Sometimes there's a gentle-faced bodhisattva of compassion, and sometimes there's a fierce-faced bodhisattva of compassion. Wisdom is knowing which one is called for and when. As a cop, if I have a compassionate intention in my heart, if my intention is really to serve and protect and to breathe life into the values that a democracy is built on, and if I have to use some form of force to prevent somebody from hurting somebody else, that is fierce compassion. However, if I'm angry and irritated and I'm sick of doing this stuff and I want to get on to the next call and I respond from that place, that's violence. So compassion always begins with me," she says, "but engaged Buddhism also means recognizing where injustice exists, not making other people the enemy, but compassionately and wisely working for change." This may sound pretty different from Jesus' sermon about loving your enemies, but they are related. Jesus offers a litany of things that really get a rise out of a person. Somebody who hates you, who slaps you, who takes your coat. Our first instinct when these kinds of things happen, or when somebody cuts us off in traffic, or they take credit for something we did, or whatever it is, our first instinct when that happens is to lash back out, right back at them. Right? Don't do that, he's saying. Don't do the mindless thing. Do the unexpected thing. The unexpected thing is compassion and generosity. But Jesus could also be fierce. He could be a fierce bodhisattva. One time he was so disgusted with the abuses of the rich and the entitled, he threw over a table in the temple. He was so fiercely effective that those in power were so threatened that they took away his life. And yet he modeled compassion toward the same kind of people, like when he spent time with the tax collectors, which in that society was a group who took terrible advantage of others. He wore gentle and fierce faces of compassion. We're putting Buddhist and Christian stories and teachings into conversation with each other today because what I'm describing to you is a kind of very ancient wisdom that transcends any particular religious tradition and that has been proven time and again in the history of humankind. The civil rights activist Ruby Sales has become one of our nation's wise elders in this modern time. She grew up on black folk religion that was formed during the American slavery era on plantations without reliance on church institutions or buildings or ministers. That's what she was raised on, and she recalls that it too was very peace-oriented. I'm going to lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside and study war no more. She grew up singing that beautiful old spiritual. But when she went to her first demonstration during the civil rights movement, she says she was naive and unsophisticated in applying her faith. She recalls, "I was part of the Pepsi generation who really believed that right was right and it would win out. So on my first demonstration, and I'm embarrassed to say this, we were surrounded by horses and state troopers who wouldn't let us go to the bathroom. And I kept looking up at the sky, waiting for the Exodus story to happen to me. And it didn't happen. I expected God to appear in some chariot to open up in the sky because I couldn't imagine we were so right and God would be so wrong." She became angry after that, and she drifted away from her religion for a long time. And then she had a transformative moment one day, not during a protest or at a church, but at the hair salon. Her hairdresser's daughter came into the room, and the daughter looked terrible. Sales says the young woman was on drugs and had been, quote, hustling all night. Ruby Sales had the instinct to ask her a question. She asked, Shelley, this daughter's name was Shelley. She said, Shelley, where does it hurt? And the next thing she knew, Shelley was telling stories about the wounds she had acquired in life that even her mother did not know. As Ruby Sales began to understand the power of compassion for healing society, for peacemaking, she recalled the wisdom in the old tradition, and she came back to it again. Now Ruby Sales poses that question as a social justice question. Where does it hurt? Because imagining that others are as human as we are and are suffering as we are is the path of peace. And she says that when Martin Luther King Jr. said, I've been to the mountaintop, he was talking about a higher plane of consciousness. It was about connecting and harmonizing the we with the I. After Jesus speaks his words about radically committing to peace, he says that those who listen to him about love and nonviolence and non-judgment and mercy are like a person building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on rock. When a flood came, the torrent struck that house but could not shake it because it was well built. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a person who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed and its destruction was complete. Build peace on a strong foundation, or it will merely be the absence of war. And as soon as a torrent of disagreement and tension arises, it will collapse. But build it on the belief of the inherent worth and dignity of every person, on compassion, and on a deep well of strength rather than sheer force, and you'll have peace to last through storms, peace to pass down along generations. In other words, there's no path to peace. Peace is the path. There's one more thing Ruby Sales says that I want to share with you this morning. She says, one of the things that theologies must have is hindsight, insight, and foresight. That is complete sight. A theology that reaches back to the past for the wisdom of our ancestors and looks into how to practice it today and what else might inform it now, and which strives to build something lasting with good foundations for the future. That's not just a theology with complete sight, that's a theology with a vision. Yeah. When you leave this place today, you go public. So do I. We go out from our sanctuary, we go out from our UU worship service, and through what we do and what we say, our lives speak for us. They speak for our public theology. And it makes an impact on the world because each of us influences other people. And what we do and how we live and how we treat others, all of that is much clearer evidence of what our religion is than what we say it is. That's what others are going to remember about us. I've done 4 memorial services in the last 2 weeks, a really high number. And none of them were filled with wonderful quotes by the deceased. They were not remembered for their words. They were remembered for their actions and their relationships, and especially for the times when their kindness, love, or generosity exceeded what would have been easy, convenient, or comfortable. When we leave this place today, that is when we put our theology into action in the world. May it be one built on strong foundations, a theology of vision and loving kindness, and sometimes gentle, and sometimes fierce, but always unwavering compassion. Peace be with you.